While the American conception of battlecruisers will still be covered in a video in the proper series, I decided I will go over the Lexingtons as a class in this video. In a similar vein to the Saratoga or Sadeless video, this will cover the ships themselves more so than their history, at least in this case. As different to those videos, this has to focus more on design and technical features. Those ships never saw service. Well, I should say they never saw service as battlecruisers. Saratoga, of course, already has a video, and Lexington will, eventually, have a video of her own, so the history of the ships is less of a focus here, at least in regards to their non-existent service history. Anyway, to start, it is important to remember that the only class of American battlecruisers had a design process that the word torturous barely even covers. I have been reading and researching on ship design for quite a while at this point, and there are very few designs that went through so many different stages as these ships. The United States Navy and its various design boards had already put thought into a battlecruiser even before Invincible was finished. That is the start of this process. Now, similar to the British ship, most of these are more accurately big armored cruiser, and a proper battle cruiser only came about towards the tail end of the 1900s and the start of the 1910s. By this point, it was becoming apparent that armored cruisers were less useful in the face of battle cruisers, though the Navy was still not entirely interested in the concept. British and German construction meant relatively little, as it was highly unlikely, and let's be realistic here, it was very unlikely, that the US would go to war with either power, even though war plans existed for such a contingency. That being said, the US in the 1900s had contingencies for going to war with Canada, so take what you will from that. That being said, when Japan ordered Congo, and more importantly, the three sisters to that ship, plans very suddenly and rapidly changed. Japan was, even at the time, seen as a bigger threat and rival to American interests, particularly in the Philippines and China, than the British or Germans ever were. The Congo class was, as well, markedly superior to the American armored cruisers, even the most modern ones with the 10-inch guns. Of course, you could say the same about the British and German battlecruisers as well. But since Japan was considered a bigger issue, and it made the Pacific Fleet distinctly unprepared for a confrontation with those battlecruisers, the USN suddenly scrambled to make their own design as a counter. These design studies in the early 1910s tended to be directed largely at creating what can be described as an American Congo, in very loose terms. Ships with 8 14-inch guns, sounds about right, roughly 29 knots in speed, also about right, and with armor laid out much like in Nevada. The thing of it is, that would be a far superior armor to Congo, but I digress. So maybe you should call it more like a Super Congo? This design would go through several stages, differing in speed and armor, while the main armament remained the same. You could have ships designed for 28 knots, 29 knots, 30 knots, ships with 8 inches, 9 inches, even up to 12 inches of armor. Again, this was a pretty torturous design process. However, in a familiar scene to anyone who has studied the USN prior to World War II, Congress was penny pinching and refusing to authorize any large construction projects. In light of this fact, and realizing that they could have battleships or battlecruisers, not both, the Navy was, perhaps, far more interested in using their limited funds to build more of the standard battleships pioneered by USS Nevada. In all honesty, it is kind of hard to argue this decision when Congress was inclined to only authorize one battleship, perhaps 2 on a good year, per year. Now, the British, with the Royal Navy, they could afford to build both, when they could order an entire class of battleships alongside a battlecruiser. Even then, they could only do that because the Germans were naval arms racing them, and that was enough to make the British Treasury decide they actually wanted order ships. It really needs its own topic, and we're not going to get too into detail there. The USN, for what it was worth, could not do that. Even with the Japanese threat, the Congress just did not want to do that. So while design work would continue at a very slow pace, there was no real indication these ships could ever be ordered, let alone built. Mind you, when World War I started, even Congress could only be so penny-pinching. 6 battlecruisers would be authorized as part of the greater 1916-1917 naval budget, intended, at least at that point, for completion by 1919. This was perhaps a bit optimistic. Once the United States actually joined the war, construction shifted to focusing on lighter escorts and the like. Hello, several hundred four-stacker destroyers. How are you doing, Clemson and Wicks? Instead of capital ships. Construction of the standards, Nevada and her successors, continued, but not the battlecruisers nor their equivalent South Dakota-class battleships. In the case of the battlecruisers, this process was, honestly, a good thing. The original 1917 design was questionable in certain design choices. As I mentioned in the battlecruiser video, the Lexingtons, at this point at least, were less battlecruisers and more oversized giant scout cruisers. In fact, design documents sometimes refer to battle scouts, because it's not enough to have one different designation in relation to these ships. The designs that were originally authorized often featured armor only sufficient against 6-inch cruiser guns, in this case, around a 5-inch belt. Their firepower seems all right, 10, 14-inch guns. That would seem quite enough for most combat against other battlecruisers or even battleships when they were designed. Think about 1917 and think about what ships were soon to come out. The German Bayerns, Hood and her sisters. The Japanese were starting to develop the Omegis. They had already built the Nagato, the G3, N3, the German GK series, which I'll be getting into in the German video. All of those ships make 10, 14-inch guns look kind of quaint in comparison. They would have been quite obsolete by the time they were completed, had the Washington Treaty, and in the case of the German designs, World War I, not kneecapped the late war designs. If this wasn't enough of a problem, their power plant was also kind of primitive at the time. So boiler design was up to the point where they could get to the, frankly, insane 35 knots top speed, but only if they would put half of the boilers above the armor deck, and made the ships so incredibly long that they would have had very severe issues with bending in anything even remotely resembling hard seas. It also required the most, shall we say, interesting feature in this design, at least from how the appearance was. The Lexington 1917 designs had no fewer than 7 funnels. I'm not joking. They literally had 7 funnels. It doesn't look that weird from the side, but just look at it from the top and you see how weird 7 funnels on a ship actually looks. That entirely aside, as it became apparent that the British and Japanese were moving to larger guns, 15 and 16 inch respectively, on their next battlecruisers, the USN at first moved to change from 10 14-inch guns to 8 16-inch guns on the Lexingtons. The thing of it is, though, this would be done without changing their armor protection, which kind of made them equivalent to the British Courageous class, the so-called, because the British were trying to get them past the fact their treasury wanted authorized capital ships, large light cruisers. Albeit, they still had more guns, but Lexingtons also still had no armor, so it's still questionable design choices there. At least improvements in boiler technology allowed for moving the power plant back where it should have been, underneath the armor belt and armor deck. But it was still 5 funnels at this point, which is not much better from an aesthetic standpoint. It also still had the flaws of the armor protection and the extreme length, making the ships prone to bending. Now, with the advent of HMS Hood and the British sharing her design, even back then, the British trusted us more than they probably should have. The American design teams had, shall we say, a bit of a panic at the design of Hood. Emergency redesigns were called for, some of which were fast battleships. I mean, you can argue very convincingly that Hood is a fast battleship. Remember the British thing for calling anything faster than 25 knots a battlecruiser. These designs, though, were akin to the South Dakota class, but with less armor and far more speed, and less guns for that matter. The final 4 redesigns at this period called for anything from a slower and slightly better armored Lexington to what amounted to a fast battleship version of the original design. That was Design D, which is very interesting when you look at it, because it is basically the American answer to Hood, but better in just about every way. The problem is, it was correspondingly more expensive, and perhaps a bit too forward-thinking for the American naval staff. The fast battleship concepts were rejected, as they would render the entire, still under construction at this point, fleet of standard battleships obsolete before they were even completed. It would have been a revolution akin to that of dreadnoughts, and the Navy was not incredibly interested in obsoleting their entire, still under construction, fleet for a potential leg up on the British or Japanese. Mind you, Hood already would have ushered in this revolution if not for the Washington Naval Treaty, but the treaty happened, so the standards endured longer than they probably should have. Keeping all of this in mind, the selected design that became the final design for the Lexingtons was an evolution of the original design, up-armored to 7 inches, angled, as in Hood, to increase relative thickness, though it's still not the thickest armor in the world, with 8 16-inch guns, a secondary battery of new 6-inch guns, these being the same 6-inch guns developed for the Omaha-class cruisers, and a slight reduction in speed to 33 knots, which is still faster than any battlecruiser under construction or complete by that point. These ships were still intended, though, for a more scout-heavy role than battlecruisers in the Royal Navy had become by this point. But in light of the fact that the losses at Jutland had less to do with the lack of armor or doctrine, and more to do with incredibly dumb powder handling, and equally incredibly explosive cordite, the Lexingtons are undeniably under-armored. I don't try and dispute that point. They're still less likely to explode violently than most people assume of battlecruisers. How they would have fared in actual combat is hard to judge, though perhaps not as badly as is commonly assumed. American powder handling and powder were, in general, better than British equivalents and far less likely to blow up for random reasons. At this point, though, we have to end the story of these ships. The final design was laid down, with 6 ships still intended to be built. Those ships were the USS Lexington, Constellation, Saratoga, Ranger, Constitution, and United States. CC 1 through 6. These ships would most likely have been completed in the late 1920s, entering service around the same time as their direct competitors in the Amagi class of Japan. Unfortunately for these long-delayed and constantly redesigned ships, politics would intervene again. The aforementioned Washington Naval Conference and Naval Treaty of 1921 would end all construction on new capital ships, with a couple exceptions, one of the American Colorados, the British Nelsons, and the Japanese Mutsu being those exceptions. The Lexingtons, alongside their companions in the South Dakotas, the 1920 South Dakotas, they'll get a video on their own eventually, would be canceled well before they could be completed. It is, though, arguable that the Navy would get far more out of the 2 survivors, Lexington and Saratoga, after they were converted to large carriers. As I went over in Saratoga's own video, these ships would be invaluable, completely invaluable, to developing American naval doctrine and carrier design in these early 1930s. These ships did so much for American carriers that it's really hard for you to say they would have done more if we had built the 6, arguably obsolete by the time they were finished, battlecruisers. Because the Lexingtons would have been going up against the Imagis with more guns, the G3s, which were, for all intents and purposes, fast battleships that the British weren't weird about what they called things, and the Japanese eventually would have developed the Key and the number 13 designs. Suffice it to say, the Lexingtons were definitely outdated by the time they would have been completed as battlecruisers. So having 2 of them as carriers that did so much for American carrier design was probably more useful. Even so, it is, as a fan of battlecruisers and a student of naval history, a bit upsetting at not seeing these beautiful, once they were limited to, and we're saying 2 funnels, ships in motion as they were intended.